The moment my wife told the divorce court that I had spent 29 years doing absolutely nothing, I was sitting less than 4 feet away from her, completely silent. She sounded confident, prepared, almost proud. But what no one in that courtroom knew was that one simple question from the judge was about to expose a truth she had spent years hiding. Asterisk, the morning my wife told the court I had contributed nothing to our marriage, I didn't interrupt her once. I sat there quietly, hands folded on the table, watching the same woman I had spent nearly 3 decades with explain to a judge how useless I had been. Her voice was calm, practiced, almost theatrical. She spoke about the house she said she managed, the investment she said she created, the life she claimed she built while I simply existed beside her. According to her story, I had coasted through 29 years collecting a paycheck while she carried the weight of everything. Her attorney nodded confidently as if every word had already won the case. My lawyer leaned toward me and slid a small note across the table that read, "Do you want to respond?" I looked at it for a moment, then slowly shook my head no. The judge noticed that. She studied me for a second longer than she studied my wife, and in that moment I realized something strange. The quiet in that room wasn't working against me. It was waiting. Asterisk, my wife, Elena, was 26 when I met her. I was 32. We met at a charity fundraiser in Chicago where she worked in marketing, and I attended mostly out of obligation. She had the kind of personality that filled a room instantly, confident, energetic, sharp. Within minutes of talking to her, you felt like you had known her for years. That charm was powerful, and for a long time I believed it was also genuine. We married a year later in a small ceremony beside Lake Michigan. Life moved quickly after that. We had 2 children, bought a house in a quiet suburb, and built what from the outside looked like a stable, successful family. Elena handled many of the daily decisions, school schedules, home repairs, social events while I spent long hours working. That arrangement slowly became our routine. She often joked to friends that she ran the household while I just paid the bills. People laughed. I laughed too. At the time, it felt harmless. What I didn't realize was that over the years, the joke quietly turned into a narrative. She repeated so often that even our children began to believe it. And somewhere along the way, Elena started managing more than the house. She started managing every financial detail as well. Asterisk, the first sign that something wasn't right came from my older brother. One evening he mentioned that my mother had been confused about a withdrawal from her savings account. My mother was 82 at the time, but still mentally sharp, so hearing that worried me. Elena had been helping her with errands for years, driving her to appointments and picking up groceries whenever I was traveling for work. My mother always praised her for that. She used to say Elena was the daughter she never had, but when I asked Elena about the withdrawal, she dismissed it instantly. She said my mother had simply forgotten about a transfer she had approved weeks earlier. Her explanation sounded reasonable, and I let the matter drop. But a few weeks later, another strange detail surfaced. My mother mentioned that some jewelry from her bedroom had been moved to safe storage. Elena again had an explanation ready. She said she was protecting valuable items from being misplaced. Everything sounded logical, yet something about the pattern began to bother me. I had spent most of my career analyzing situations where things looked normal on the surface, but weren't. And once that instinct wakes up, it's very difficult to ignore. Asterisk, instead of confronting Elena directly, I did something she never expected. I started paying attention. Over the next 3 months, I reviewed financial records, bank statements, and account histories connected to both our household and my mother's finances. What I found was far more complicated than I had imagined. Small transfers had been made from my mother's accounts over several years, none of them large enough to trigger suspicion individually, but together they formed a pattern. Tens of thousands of dollars had quietly moved into accounts connected to Elena's consulting work. That consulting business was another surprise. I knew she did occasional freelance marketing projects, but the records showed something much bigger. She had been operating a full consulting company for nearly 5 years. Several payments entering those accounts were legitimate, but others were questionable. Some clients appeared real, Others existed only on paper. As the information came together, the picture became impossible to ignore. The woman who had just told the court I knew nothing about finances had been using that assumption as her greatest protection. She believed my silence meant ignorance. What she didn't know was that silence had always been part of how I worked. Asterisk, when the divorce hearing began, Elena's attorney presented their case confidently. He described a marriage where she carried every responsibility while I contributed very little. He portrayed her as the architect of our financial stability and me as a passive bystander who never asked questions. Elena spoke for nearly 20 minutes repeating the same theme. She said she had managed everything because I had no interest in doing so. The courtroom remained quiet as she finished. Then the judge leaned back slightly and looked at her attorney. She asked him a simple question in a calm voice. "Counselor," she said, "before we proceed, are you aware of Mr. Mercer's professional background?" The attorney looked confused and shook his head. The judge adjusted her glasses and glanced at the file in front of her. "Because according to the documentation submitted this morning," she continued, "Mr. Mercer spent 25 years working in federal financial investigations." The room became completely still. My wife turned toward me slowly. The expression on her face shifted in a way I will never forget. It was the look of someone realizing the person they underestimated might have been watching much more closely than they thought. Asterisk, key hearing ended sooner than anyone expected that day. Elena's attorney requested time to review the documents my lawyer had submitted. The judge granted it immediately and made it clear that several of the financial records raised concerns far beyond a typical divorce dispute. As people began leaving the courtroom, Elena avoided looking at me entirely. The confident tone she had used earlier was gone. Outside in the hallway, my lawyer asked me one quiet question. "How long have you known?" I told him the truth. "Long enough." Weeks later, the settlement proposal arrived, dramatically different from the one she originally demanded. Assets were returned, debts were acknowledged, accounts were repaid, and the story about the husband who built nothing quietly disappeared. But sometimes I still think about that morning in court, about the moment when everyone believed her version of the story, right before the judge asked a single question. Because silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means someone has nothing to say, but sometimes it means they already know everything. And now I wonder something I've never asked before. If you were in that courtroom listening to her story, would you have believed her too?